Hey everybody. So today I want to talk about the axiology of theism and faith, both what faith is and what makes faith rational. And my main goal today is to bring this one literature we're going to talk more about in a second, the axiology of theism, into contact with the faith literature. Basically, I think the two literatures have quite a bit in common. They have a lot of interesting things to say to each other, but no one's really brought them together, at least explicitly that I know of yet. So I think there's some interesting connections to be made here. The first is that I think questions in the axiology of theism bear on questions about faith and faith's rationality in an interesting way. The first way is that counterevidence, getting evidence against the thing you have faith in, that might not be the only thing that makes faith irrational. And also, the person of faith might, at least to an extent, need to take a stand in the axiology of theism. But that said, I want to sort of explore ways these might be true, but we can still affirm them in a relatively ecumenical way. So I don't want, to make having faith extremely difficult, to put a really high bar, like you can only have faith if you meet these very explicit conditions that are hard to meet or something, or to say that almost all faith is irrational. And basically, I have 5 main conclusions. The first is that I think a lot of the faith literature has centered around this debate of whether faith entails belief, like a flat out belief. And I think there's an interesting parallel debate to be had, which is a debate about whether faith entails a flat out desire or not. The second upshot is that faith involves conative resilience, so not just cognitive resilience. And I think people interested in faith should be paying more attention to this. The third upshot is that I think the person who has faith that God exists can't be a strong anti-theist. I will explain what that means later, in case you don't know what that means yet. And then relatedly, well, not exactly relatedly, but along similar lines about anti-theism, that the truth of anti-theism, nonetheless, might not render faith that God exists irrational. And then the final upshot, which I actually mentioned on a previous video before, but I think it's related to this paper as well, is that self-justifying desires, especially in the case of God's existence, I think they're a phenomena that's worth exploring. Okay, so let's start off by just talking a little bit about the axiology of theism, which is section 2. And then actually just to give a brief overview, then we'll move to talking about faith. Both questions like what is faith and also what makes faith irrational. And then those 5 upshots we just discussed, we will go over in more detail. Okay, so starting with the axiology of theism, just backing up a little bit, when it comes to philosophy of religion, there's 3 questions that I think you can ask. The first involves the ontology of theism, the ontological question, which is just the question of whether God exists. The second is the epistemology of theism, which is, should we believe that God exists? Can belief that God exists be rational? And then the third is the axiology of theism. Should we want God to exist, or would God's existence be a good thing? And I think setting it up this way is helpful for 2 reasons. The first is that you can really mix and match these views. So you could be an atheist who thinks that nonetheless it can be rational to believe that God exists. You could also think it's rational to believe that God exists, but we shouldn't want God to exist. Or you could be a theist, but say we shouldn't want God to exist, right? So you can kind of, these views, at least in principle, cross-cut each other, which I think is interesting. The second is that the axiology of theism sort of fits nicely with the ontology and epistemology of theism, but I think it's been given by far the least attention. A lot has been written on whether God exists, going way, way back through the history of philosophy, but also the question of whether we should believe God exists, whether theistic belief or theistic faith could be rational, has gotten so much attention. Even recently, it's almost like it's one of the biggest topics in philosophy of religion. But this axiological question, I mean, some people have written on it. It's not like no one's written on it. We even actually held a conference on it at Ryerson this summer, but it just really hasn't received the attention that the other two have had, which I think is interesting. So let's hone in on this third question, this axiology question. When it comes to the axiology of theism, there's two main positions. There's other positions as well, but here's the two main ones. The first is pro-theism. Pro-theism is the view that God's existence would be a good thing. And, roughly the thought is, well, if God exists, there's ultimate cosmic justice and wrongdoers are held accountable for their actions. Human lives are meaningful. God gives lives meaning. No evil is gratuitous or pointless. I mean, there's debate about whether gratuitous evil is consistent with theism, but at least there's a lot less gratuitous evil if God exists. So those are some reasons to think God's existence would be a good thing. Anti-theism, on the other hand, is the view that God's existence would be a bad thing. And so anti-theists point out things like this. Well, if God exists, this invades our privacy. We can't do private things or have private thoughts because God knows all the things we're doing and thinking. Some people have also said it renders morality incoherent. Maybe if no evil is gratuitous and all evil ultimately benefits the sufferer's greater good, then it's not wrong for me to just punch you in the face because God's going to, turn that into a greater good and compensate you even more in the future. That's a little confusing. And you might also think that if God doesn't exist, some lives are meaningless or absurd. So, maybe the life of the person, the life of the atheist who, just doesn't care about God, doesn't believe in God, that person's life, you could argue, is meaningless. So, those are at least some reasons that people have argued or pushed anti-theism. And note that, I think I mentioned this briefly already, but these aren't the only two positions you could take. So you could say, well, the worlds with God and the worlds without God are equally good. So it's not that God's existence makes the world better or worse. It doesn't make a value difference at all. You could also say the relevant facts about value are undetermined or unknowable. So some people call those like quietist views, but we can kind of set those views aside for the purposes of our paper. This paper, the main two that we're going to be talking about are pro and anti-theism. There's a further distinction too between personal and impersonal views. And so on personal views, God's existence would be a good or bad thing for us. Whereas on impersonal views, God's existence would be a good or bad thing for the world. So you might say, like, adding this perfect, all-loving, all-knowing being, like, clearly in some sense adds objective value to the world, but maybe you think this like invades our privacy and makes our lives meaningless, and so it's bad for us. So you can combine like the personal and the impersonal views. This is an important distinction. I'm not totally sure that it's going to be super important for what I have to say later, but I'm happy to sort of hear feedback on that. But I just wanted to mention it because I do think it is an important distinction. Okay, so that's a little bit of background on the axiology of theism. Now let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about faith. So this section on faith is basically divided into two parts. The first part is about the nature of faith, and then the second part is about the rationality of faith. Okay, so I'm going to focus on propositional faith, which is faith that some statement or proposition is true. And sort of to shed light on the nature of faith, I think it will help to consider the difference between two kinds of mental states that we have. We have cognitive mental states, and these mental states have a mind to world direction of fit, meaning that when you see something out there in the world, your mind conforms to the way that the world is. So examples of these states are, beliefs or credences or beliefs about probabilities. And to explain this direction of fit thing, when you look outside and you see that it's raining outside, your belief then conforms to the world. So that's what we mean when we say it has a mind to world direction of fit. These cognitive states also represent the world. They represent the world, they represent certain things as true or likely. Okay, then there's conative states. So conative states have a world to mind direction of fit. So they have an opposite direction of fit. And a lot of people think they're also sort of inherently motivational. These would be like desires, pro attitudes, or beliefs about the good. So, for example, if you are hungry and you desire food, then you go to the fridge and eat. That's what we mean when we say it has a world to mind direction of it. When you desire something, you're motivated to make the world conform to your mind rather than vice versa. So this brings us to a definition of faith that I think is pretty plausible and pretty common in the faith literature. That's this 4-part definition here on the bottom of the first page. So someone has faith that some proposition is true if and only if they have a positive cognitive attitude towards that proposition. So they think it's likely, they have a high credence in it, they believe it. And the thought behind this is, well, if you think that the proposition is impossible or extremely unlikely, you just can't have faith. And that's kind of the motivation behind this first condition. There's a controversy here. Some people think faith just requires a flat out belief. So everything you have faith in, you believe. Other people think, well, maybe faith could be consistent with something like, moderate or high confidence, or thinking something's likely to be true, but it doesn't always require a flat out belief. So that's one of the big debates in the faith literature. We don't need to take a stand on that here. Okay. The second condition is that you have a positive conative attitude towards the proposition in question, which means that you think it would be a good thing or you desire it. So if you're about to, run a big race and I have faith that you'll make your time, but I really want you to lose, that doesn't really make sense. That's confusing. It's hard to see how I could have faith that you'll make your time if I desire you to lose. And this conative attitude is one thing that separates faith and belief. There's lots of things that we believe that we have no desire at all to be true. I believe there's a global pandemic. I believe that a conference I was excited about was canceled, but I don't have faith in those things. And one, I think clear way to spell the difference is because these things that I believe but don't have faith in, I don't desire to be true. Faith requires this desire component. Okay. The third is that faith involves a commitment. So if you have faith that some proposition is true, you have some kind of commitment to that proposition. And because of this commitment, you're going to be resilient to at least some degree to counter evidence against the truth of that proposition. So I think one function of faith is faith helps us keep our commitments over time, whether that's a theistic commitment or, maybe a commitment to finishing some important life project or picking up a new instrument or starting a new workout routine or a marriage. And because faith helps us keep our commitments, it's resilient to counter evidence that we might come across when making a commitment. However, I don't think this means that faith is going to be resilient in light of any amount of counter evidence. So we shouldn't keep our faith commitments no matter what. Maybe if you have a slight suspicion that your spouse is being unfaithful to you, but it's pretty weak evidence, that might be a case where, given how much you have to gain if that evidence is misleading, you should continue in your commitment to your spouse. But, if you see a video of your spouse cheating on you, it's a different story, right? So the point is that we should keep our commitments over time. Faith helps us do that, but it's not in light of any amount of counter evidence against our commitments. So we shouldn't just keep our commitments no matter what. That's consistent with faith nonetheless being resilient to counter evidence. Okay, so maybe let's just talk about 2 quick examples to kind of motivate this 4-part definition, and then we'll consider an objection. So suppose that I have faith that you will win your upcoming basketball game. In this case, it's plausible that I think it's at least sufficiently likely that you'll win. If I think it's impossible that you'll win and I'm just totally convinced you're going to get crushed, I probably can't and definitely shouldn't have faith that you'll win. This kind of attitude seems to rule out faith. also, I want you to win. So it doesn't make sense to say that I have faith that you'll win your game if I really want you to lose or I'm cheering for the other team, or if I just don't care either way. If I'm like, I don't care who wins. Seems like I need to have on some level some kind of desire for you to win. Third, if I have faith that you'll win your game, I have some kind of commitment to that. Maybe I'm committed to your team or a dedicated fan, or I just have a commitment to you as a friend. And then finally, if I have faith that you'll win your upcoming game, I will, to some extent, continue to have faith, even in light of non-decisive counterevidence. So, for example, if one of your starting 5 players gets injured, I'll continue to have faith that you'll win. If all of your starting 5 players get injured, or if you're down 40 points with 2 minutes to go, then that's a case where maybe I should give up my faith. Okay. I think that faith that God exists also fits into this definition well. So if you have faith that God exists, you have a positive cognitive attitude towards theism, whether that's, a belief, high confidence, or something else. Again, people debate about whether this requires a flat out belief or not. But I think we can all agree that you can't have faith that God exists if you think God's existence is impossible or even just enormously unlikely. Okay. Second, if you have faith that God exists, you need to have a positive conative attitude towards God's existence. So you need to desire God to exist or think God's existence would be a good thing, at least on some level. I'm going to talk more about what exactly that looks like a lot, actually, in the rest of this paper. But most people in the literature, I will say, have kind of thought this. Third is you have a commitment to God. You have some kind of religious commitment. And then fourth is you will, to some extent, continue to have faith that God exists in the light of non-decisive counter-evidence. So maybe you're struggling with the problem of evil or struggling with divine hiddenness. I think that having faith that God exists is consistent with struggling with those things, as long as those aren't, decisive counter-evidence for you that make you think it's like impossible for God to exist or just enormously unlikely. So faith that God exists, again, is resilient in this way. So here in this paper, we're going to be focusing on this second component, the conative component. And I think, I'm kind of okay with just sort of assuming that faith has this desire-like state, especially because we're really focusing on faith in God. And I think a lot of people agree with that. But you might kind of push back here. And this leads me to this objection at the top of page 2. Is this component too strong? What about someone who really doesn't want God to exist, but they feel rationally compelled to commit to Christianity? You might think like C.S. Lewis falls in this category. And I guess in response, what I want to note is that desiring something to be true, that's consistent with a lot of things going on in your head, and sometimes quite complicated things. Okay, so you can desire God to exist while also having conflicting desires. You could think you want God to exist on some level, but also for some reasons don't want God to exist or want God not to exist. And like one thing that philosophers will talk about with these cases is like weakness of will cases. So let's say you're trying to cut back on sugar and you've really made this commitment to yourself that like you're not going to eat sugar on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, let's just say. But your partner just made an amazing looking chocolate cake. And so you're like, oh man, like I don't want the cake. I made this commitment to myself, but I also really want the cake. And you might actually end up even eating the cake, even despite your stronger desire not to eat the cake. This is called weakness of will. And so I think desiring for some proposition to be true is consistent with desiring it also not to be true, or desiring something is also consistent with desiring the opposite of that thing. So you can have conflicting desires for sure. You can also desire things without there being sort of strong emotions associated with them. So, a related example, maybe you've made a commitment to try to work out regularly and you do want to go to the gym. You did make this commitment to yourself, but you're really dreading it and you're not excited about this. And sometimes I feel like this when I'm going to the gym. I definitely still in some sense desire to go to the gym. I'm just not feeling it. I don't have those emotions associated with the gym at that point. And Also, you can desire things weakly. So you can have a desire, but not this super strong, like overwhelming desire, right? Maybe that's because you have conflicting desires, or maybe you think something's good, but maybe it could be better. Or again, maybe you're just not feeling it, So I think, just because you desire something doesn't mean there aren't these other things that are also true of you. And I think that said, in order to have faith that God exists or that a certain religion is true, you need to think there's some element of goodness in that religion. So on some level, you need to desire it in order to have genuine faith. Notice, though, you could be a theist. You could believe that God exists and not have this desire. And some people become a theist before they make the full-blown religious commitment. So I'm not making a claim about what's required to believe that God exists, but to have a faith commitment to a religion, I do think you have to have some level of desire for it to be true. I'll also discuss, though, later in the paper, ways we might kind of weaken this. And one of my points I want to talk about later is some people deny that faith entails belief, but it could be associated with a weaker cognitive attitude. And I want to explore the idea that maybe faith actually doesn't entail flat out desire, but is consistent with some kind of weaker cognitive attitude. That's already kind of previewed by some of the things I already said about conflicting desires or not having strong emotions, but we'll get into more of that in a second. Okay, let's go to section 2.2, which is that basically gave us like a 4-part definition of what faith is. Now let's think about the rationality of faith. So I think a natural thought when it comes to faith's rationality, faith is made up of these different components, the cognitive, the conative, commitment component. And I think it's natural to think that faith's rationality depends on the rationality of each of these components. So let's start with the cognitive component. A lot of attention has been paid here, and I think a lot of the faith literature has really focused on what makes faith's cognitive component rational, whether that's like a belief or high confidence or whatever. People asking, how could rational faith be consistent with counterevidence? Huge question here. Does faith always have to involve belief? Related, huge question that people have talked a lot about. But yeah, I mean, when we think about what makes a cognitive attitude rational, I think this is going to be familiar to a lot of us. The idea is that cognitive states, in some sense, aim at truth or accuracy, right? And so what makes a cognitive state cognitive state rational is evidence that points us to the truth. So evidence that the proposition in question is true is what makes it rational. And, how much evidence or what kind of evidence could be different for different cognitive states. Some people think belief and credence are different here. But the thought is that if someone's evidence decisively supports the proposition that God does not exist, maybe makes the probability that God exists 0 or very close to 0, then it's irrational for them to have faith. So the beginning of this talk, we talked about the ontological question, whether God exists, and the epistemological question, whether it's rational to believe in God. These two questions are going to be very closely related to these questions about faith's cognitive rationality. Okay, so I think a lot of that is going to be familiar to people. Let's instead think about what makes faith conatively rational. And this is an important question because beliefs are not the only states that can be rational or irrational. Desires can be rational, like my desire to, finish my handout before I give my talk, right? Or they can be irrational, someone's desire to maybe get back with their abusive ex, right? So in the same way beliefs are rational and irrational, desires are rational and irrational. And because of this, then there's questions about faith's rationality that involve this desire component of faith. So conative states, unlike cognitive states, which aim at the truth, conative states aim at the good. So what makes a conative state rational is not evidence that P is true, but evidence that P is good. So take an agent whose evidence decisively supports the proposition that God's existence would be a bad thing. I think for similar reasons, for parallel reasons, it might not be rational for them to have faith. And this is, I think, where the axiology of theism comes in very, very clearly, right? So it looks like pro-theism, the view that God's existence would be a good thing, is a much better fit with faith and with rational faith than with anti-theism. And so one thing that's really interesting about this is that, and maybe this isn't super surprising, but all those three questions, the ontological, epistemological, and axiological questions, all three of those are involved in theistic faith. Maybe that's not surprising, but I think that's really interesting. You know, and I do think there's some interesting questions about how parallel belief and desire are going to be here, right? Are they perfectly parallel? So here's a couple of potential asymmetries that I think are interesting to think more about. First, you know, it can't be true that both P and not P, right? It can't be true that it's raining and that it's not raining. But both P and not P could be good. Like, it could be good for me to accept a writing invitation to contribute a chapter to the book because I get to explore a new topic and it helps my tenure case. But it could also be good if I don't accept it because I'm very busy and I would have to sacrifice somewhere else, like spending time with friends and family. So while both P and not P aren't true, both P and not P can be good. And because of this, it's not as clear that having conflicting desires is as irrational as having conflicting beliefs. Most people think that, it's really hard to believe that it's raining and it's not raining, but maybe in some cases you can have contradictory beliefs. Like if you're really paranoid and jealous, you might believe your spouse is cheating on you, but also believe they're not cheating on you because you acknowledge it's not supported by your evidence. And maybe you don't really believe these at the same time, but you're kind of double-minded and you're going back and forth between them, right? So really hard to have conflicting beliefs, almost always irrational, if not always irrational, but it's not as clear that having conflicting desires is as irrational. And so one thing this suggests, although I think this needs more thought and explanation, is that it might be actually easier to have a desire that's rational than for a belief to be rational, because you can have these conflicting desires even rationally, but you can't have conflicting beliefs. So I'm very open to someone who has conflicting desires being able to have faith. I'm not trying to say that we should like kick those people out or that they're not, true, but they don't truly have faith. I'm just saying that someone who's like a flat out anti-theist, whose desires are really just fully pointed in the direction of like, I do not want God to exist, that would be horrible, they might be excluded. When we talk about the upshots, I'll say a little bit more about that. Okay, now let's go to that section actually. So basically this talk has 5 upshots. Okay, so kind of touched on this already. This is going to be a upshot number 1 will be a descriptive question. And I think there's an interesting question parallel to this really common debate about whether faith entails belief, about whether faith entails desire. So a lot of people have argued, like going all the way back to the 80s with like Poyman and Audi, people have argued, well, maybe you could have faith without belief. And then some people more recently have pushed back and been like, no, you need faith to have belief. And, there's this whole debate going on about faith and belief. And I think interesting question, not saying not worth talking about. Of course, I like that debate. But I think there's a parallel debate that people haven't really been talking about, which is the debate about whether faith entails a flat out desire. And you might think, well, look, a lot of people have given some really interesting arguments that you don't have to have a flat out belief for faith, but maybe you could have moderate confidence. Maybe you could think think that God's existence is likely, or think it's the most likely of the live options. Or, maybe there are some of these cognitive states that are weaker than flat out belief, but they can play the relevant role in faith. If you think that, then you might think, well, maybe the states that are weaker than a flat out desire can play the conative role in faith. So instead of saying faith flat out requires a desire for P, maybe faith entails thinking P is the best out of certain alternatives. Or maybe one has conflicting desires, but the desire for God to exist is like slightly stronger. Or maybe you could think it would be equally good if God exists or God doesn't exist. But so like in some sense, this is the conative equivalent of agnosticism, but maybe you meet the other conditions for faith. So maybe that's consistent with having faith. I think all of these possibilities should be kind of thought about and explored more. You might think like making the religious commitment brings you from anti-theism to this more neutral position. Like, why rule that out for people with faith? And so I think especially if you're, opening to weakening the conative component, you might also be cognitive component, you might also be open to weakening the conative component. Although I suppose you might also think there's a belief desire asymmetry. And some of the reasons we talked about above, conflicting desires don't seem as bad as conflicting beliefs. Maybe you want to say faith requires flat out belief, but you might be a little more chill about how strict we are about what faith requires for desire. So I think that's an open question. I think that's one that people should be thinking and talking more about. Okay, this second point is a normative point about rational faith. And I think that rational faith, in the same way it involves cognitive resilience, it's also plausible that it involves conative resilience. So, like I said, a lot of people have talked about faith's epistemic resilience. How can faith be epistemically rational but go beyond the evidence, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry. But what about faith's conative resilience? So could faith persist in light of evidence that P would be a bad thing rather than just evidence that P is unlikely? So I think this is a possibility we should be very open to. You might think maybe there's another belief desire asymmetry here. Maybe faith is epistemically resilient, but not cognitively resilient, but cognitively resilient, but I don't really see why there would be that asymmetry. So I think it's plausible that faith would be resilient to evidence that P is good, not just resilient to evidence that P isn't true. So here's two examples of this. The first is a marriage. You might think about like in a marriage, when you first get married, you're kind of in this honeymoon phase, like this is the best thing ever. This is the best person ever. My spouse is the best person in the world. And then a couple of years in, you're like, oh man, this is hard. Like, oh, my spouse has these flaws that are like very salient to me that were not nearly as salient beforehand. Maybe I didn't even know about all of them beforehand. And it's like, oh, do I even want this to work out? You might have that question in your mind, right? And I don't think in this case you're necessarily questioning your commitment epistemically, but you're questioning whether it's a good thing, right? And I think plausibly, faith could help us get through these conative obstacles to faith, not just the cognitive ones. A second example involves theistic commitment. So I think a lot of people, when they first convert to a religion, they're very passionate. They're very excited about it. They're pumped to go to religious services, and they're just praying and reading scripture a lot. But over time, similar to like the marriage thing, they sort of lose their zeal. They lose their fire. And in some cases, like bad things happen that make us question whether God is good. Like, is God someone I should want to commit to my life to, whether or not theism is true? Like, is this something I should want? And I think faith, in the same way it could help us with dealing with the problem of evil or the problem of divine hiddenness, I think it could also help us with this kind of case as well. And so I think we could even capture this like in a single condition. We could say faith is resilient and helps us keep our commitments over time. And this is understood in both the epistemic sense and the conative sense. So faith is resilient to evidence that P is false, and also resilient to evidence that P is bad. Okay, that's upshot number 2. Moving to upshot number 3, this is a descriptive point, and that is that faith that God exists might be inconsistent with certain views in the Axiology of Theism. I kind of purposely made this a bit vague because I'm still kind of thinking through, I think, what stance people of faith might need to take. And this will actually depend on, whether faith entails flat out desire and how resilient faith can be in terms of loss of desire, right? But it seems to me that at least this is true, that the person of faith can't be a strong anti-theist, in the sense that they judge that all things considered, God's existence clearly would make things worse. And here's where maybe the personal versus impersonal distinction might come into play. Maybe you could be like a personal anti-theist, but not impersonal, or maybe vice versa. And so maybe this would be a way to say you could be an anti-theist in some sense, but still have faith. So I think there's some ways to kind of weaken this claim. You know, again, I don't want to be too exclusive and say like, you're just excluded from having faith. But it kind of seems like if faith really does involve this conative component, that if you really just think all things considered, God's existence would be a bad thing, and I really, really, really don't want God to exist, and this isn't like a case of conflicting desires or anything, it seems like that might rule out faith, which is kind of interesting. Also note here that desiring God to exist might not entail a belief that God's existence is a good thing, in the same way that desiring God not to exist might not entail the belief that God's existence is a bad thing, because these beliefs about the good, they might have like some kind of greater cognitive component or something, like they require grasping or conceptualizing a stronger proposition than just desiring something does. So I'm not saying that a person of faith has explicitly formed like a pro-theistic belief necessarily, but I am saying that they shouldn't explicitly form a strong anti-theistic belief. Okay. Upshot number 4 is that the truth of anti-theism might not render faith irrational. That might sound surprising at first, but hear me out. So there's a lot of distinctions to be made here, and I will agree, and people have already made a lot of distinctions in the Axiology of Theism literature. But I think the axiological question is actually ambiguous between two things. And I apologize that these are not the best labels. Maybe I can think of some better ones when I write this paper out. But the first is what you might call the ontological axiological question, which is the question of whether God's existence is a good thing. So this is the axiological parallel, of the ontological question. The second is the rationality axiological question, which is the question of whether desiring God's existence could be rational. So this is kind of the axiological parallel of the epistemological question. So it could be that something is a good thing, but you shouldn't desire it. And it could also be that it's rational for you to desire something, even though it's actually bad. This is sort of similar to the idea that you could have a rational belief because you have a ton of misleading evidence that turns out to be false. You could also have a true belief that turns out to be irrational. So I was trying to think of an example of this. You might think, like, here's a potential case. So I strongly desire, let's say, to win my basketball game tonight. And let's say this is based on evidence that winning it would be good. You know, I really want to win. I'm competitive. I think it would be awesome if my team won. But I don't really think about this fact, that losing the game would actually give us a little bit of a wake-up call, make us get our act together, make us play and practice and try harder. And then all of that will actually enable us to win our championship. And sometimes we do this. We look back and we say, you know, I was so mad at the time that I lost this game. But in retrospect, that's actually ended up what enabled us to win the championship. And I don't think that if we had won that game, we would have won the championship. So, you know, maybe my desire to win that game is rational at the time, right? But that's because I don't realize it, but it's not my fault I don't realize it. I just don't realize that it would actually be good for me to lose, because that enables us to, again, get our act together, which then enables us to win the ultimate and final championship. So I think it's worth sort of pulling these two questions apart. It could be rational to desire God's existence, even if anti-theism is true. Could also be the reverse could be true, I guess, too. It could be rational to think God's existence would be a bad thing, even if pro-theism is true. Kind of depends on your evidence about the good. And we talked earlier about there might be some like rational asymmetries with beliefs and desires. So it might be more rational to have conflicting desires than to have conflicting beliefs. So it might actually be even easier for faith to be rational, even if anti-theism is true, than it is for, the belief component of faith to be rational, even if like atheism is true. So, I've argued that desiring God's existence might be rational and faith might be rational, even if anti-theism is true. But I don't think that this means we can just ignore the first question, the question about the ontological, axiological question, right? Because I think, look, let's go back to the epistemic case. In the same way that the epistemic rationality of faith depends, at least in part, on the arguments for and against God's existence, or the evidence for and against God's existence, even if that's not arguments. The rationality of faith, at least in part, depends on the pro-theism and anti-theism considerations, right? So an anti-theist, could say, look, other people's faith is rational because they have different evidence. They have different evidence about what's good, or they weigh the evidence differently. But that doesn't mean that the rationale of that faith becomes totally apart from sort of the anti-theism, pro-theism debate. Like I said, though, it's not clear that the anti-theists themselves could have religious faith. I think this might be parallel to the way that it's difficult to see how an atheist could have religious faith. Also, I think maybe it's difficult to see how an anti-theist could have religious faith. Okay, the final upshot is just this kind of random thing that I think is really interesting. So some people in the literature have talked about self-fulfilling beliefs. These are beliefs that, when formed, create evidence that makes them more likely to be true. So they're often beliefs about yourself and how you'll sort of perform in the future. But we've talked a lot about like desires and how all this interesting stuff going on in the belief case might have sort of parallels in the desire case. And I think some of this points to the idea that there might actually be self-fulfilling desires, cases where desiring something actually makes that thing good for you. I think this specifically applies in the theistic case as well. So if you desire God to exist and you meet the other conditions, that might enable you to have faith that God exists. And then if you have faith that God exists, that might render God's existence a good thing for you, because that faith enables you to access certain benefits of theism that wouldn't be accessible without faith, like having a relationship with God, being united with God, going to heaven, etc. And in the same way, maybe if you don't have faith, you don't desire God to exist, you don't have faith, then God's existence might be bad for you, whether that's because of hell or missing out on other potential great goods like relationship with God, or just even one of the most important truths about the world and God's existence. So it's interesting how, in the same way that desiring God to exist or desiring God not to exist might be self-justifying, in the same way that people have been interested in these self-justifying beliefs. Okay, that was just a random thing that I think is interesting. And like I said, I mentioned that on a previous video where I actually talk a lot more about self-justifying beliefs. So, basically here, what I've tried to do is show how the axiology of theism and the faith literature actually have quite a bit to say to each other. And, I talked through, I think, 5 of these interesting upshots, but I think this brings out, a lot of things about the desire component of faith that are important or interesting. And I think strongly suggests that at least, very strong, committed anti-theists may not be able to have theistic faith.